Yahweh, Barakatah Yahushai, Barakatah Yahweh, Barakatah Yahushai, Barakatah Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Kakadash. Double honors and salutations to the elders and apostles of Stone Well, to the Akim Akwat, holding on in sincerity and in truth to the gospel of the Lord Hamashak Yahushai these days and times. Abraham Nasha, DC Camp, short lesson for the hopeful elect. Yes, so you see the whole drama with this war, against Iran. It's just another what you call another shit show for Babylon. Opportunity for greed to raise his head another time to to pull through the funds, man. Now you have the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, talking about at least you need another $200 billion that needs to be approved by Congress, you know, so they can continue to stay ready for the battle and all that stuff. Yeah, so that's some things, that's something you have to remember that war is a business, it's a hustle, it's a hustle because the military industrial complex, they have to get that money somehow or another. All right, so the investments has to be covered. The investments have to be assured. Has to be reinforced. That's why you have all these skirmishes around the world because they have to sell their products. They have to receive funds for their weapons to be shipped. Whether it's to Israel, whether it's to Ukraine, whether it's to all these NATO allies of the United States. And then you also have the black market. All right. So you just have to be aware that it's a dirty, shady business. They tell you one thing, but then behind is something else. And then you also have the substandard products that they sell at exorbitant prices. So the book of Sirach, chapter 27, and 1 tells you, many have sinned for a small matter. He that seeketh for abundance will turn his eyes away. All right. So that's how a lot of these politicians they get kickbacks, man. They get kickbacks when they have all these ties with the military-industrial complex. You could look at what happened during the so-called Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan. So many of the generals were getting something in the back end after their retirement. So they're living high off the hog, and those corporations were getting no bid contracts from the federal government. Yeah, it's just one of those things, man, that you have to remember. And it says in verse 2, as a nail sticketh fast between the joinings of the stones, so doth sin stick close between buying and selling. Alright, so the, the trickery, the accounting, when you hear about Aaron and all that stuff, man, it just makes you wonder, what else are they doing, that the people don't know. And then you have the so-called black budget, which a lot of the folks on Congress never talk about, So, and the audit of the Pentagon's spending has not been something, to be held in high esteem because it's just too messed up. So those that died during 9/11, you know what their job was. They couldn't complete the audit. When what's that name? The lady from oh, it was the Congresswoman, Cynthia McKinney. She kept pressing Donald Rumsfeld, the former Secretary of Defense. What's going on? What's going on with this budget, man? What's going on with this money missing? What's going on? So you realize that, yeah, the money's, it's like what you call a windfall, man. It's like a windfall. To these defense contractors, man. They just eat, 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 eat. They overpromise and underdeliver. That's just how it is. All right. Their goods are overpriced, and that's what happens. When you hear about all this selling of products to the IDF and all that stuff. What makes you think that the price is what it's supposed to be? It's overpriced. They always like to mark up, mark up, mark up, mark up, mark up. So that's how corrupt the system is. So when you see all those mansions and all those big old SUVs and all those expensive vehicles, it's all from the scam they pull. Then they send the zombies to go fight these wars. So that's also another opportunity to sell uniform, boots, food and all that stuff. Somebody got to sell buttons and zippers, shoelaces and all that stuff. So it's a big old mess. But either way, man, you just gotta proceed forward. That's the empire of Edom. Scripture talks about by the sword shall Esau live. All right. So the book of Luke chapter 14, we're going to read from 28 to 21. It says, "For which of you are intending to build a tower, sitteth not down first and counted the cost, whether he have sufficient to finish it? Lest haply after he had laid a foundation and is not able to finish it, all that behold it begin to mock him." So America is becoming the laughing stock of the West. The scam is falling apart. The e-files, is just another situation that the whole world is like constantly waiting, what's going on here? Is there any attraction? And then they realize, man, the same old people behind the e-files are the same people behind the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan and the war over there in the Middle East. So now it's a headache, for the people to deal with the aftermath of this destruction. All right. Now, verse 31 says, "Or what king going to make war against another king sitteth not down first and consulted whether he be able with 10,000 to meet him that cometh against him with 20,000?" Yeah, so all the consultations and all that stuff, that this administration is having with those so-called war planners and all that stuff, it just looks like a mess. And then you have the resignations, and then it just proves to you, man, that a lot of people are not happy, with the direction that the administration is going, and now it is, you know, a shouting match. You see the frustration in the eyes of all these politicians, man. And their and the so-called underlings. When the media begins to start pressing them for answers, they get irritated. They just gloss over important points and act as if a serious question wasn't answered, wasn't asked. All right, so that's the habit you're gonna see, man. They're just gonna disregard the calls, the inquiries of the people, and that's gonna cause more drama, more chaos. The streets of Babylon is becoming chaotic. Inflation is just eating up people's savings, man. So when you hear about interest rates and then you hear about the prices of goods and services, and then you realize that it's just another way of taxation. So folks got to prepare for it. It's gonna get worse. You just have to know that these things have to take place since the Most High has put Babylon on that war path of elimination. All right, and then 32, 32 says, or else, while the order is yet a great way off, he sendeth an ambassage and desired conditions of peace. Yeah, so hey, who knows? Who knows how they're gonna use that diplomatic, leverage to bring the war to a standstill. To cool things off. But hey, you know how it is, man. It's gonna take a lot of courage, for the men of the Lord, to hold their horses, man. Because when you see all these things beginning to happen, you get excited, and then when things cool down, you're like, oh man, how long, oh Lord. But hey, you just gotta be patient in the spirit. You have to wait, for the prophecies to be unraveled. If you read, let me say, when you read Revelation chapter 7, it tells you, you know, it tells you that the angels of the Lord, are still being held back until the four winds are let loose. All right, so you just have to learn to hold on in your spirit. So I play this clip shortly. It tells you about the military-industrial complex, man, as by the shipbuilding. It just came off from 60 Minutes.
American shipbuilding is in shambles, a money loser falling decades behind our global rivals. China makes roughly 1,000 cargo ships a year. The U.S., maybe 3.
At the end of the day, shipbuilding is a national security necessity. The U.S. needs to be able to secure our own commerce. We need to be able to export our own energy. We are in a shipbuilding crisis in the United States, and every American should be aware of that.
Yeah, so the United States is not, churning out enough ships, man. They're not, So it just shows you that, there's something else going on at the top. So it shows you that something is being done deliberately. Nothing happens by accident. So the United States military is being put in a position, to become ineffective. So when those ships that are currently in the theater of war, once they get, bombed and all that stuff, once they get defective and all that stuff, where's the replacement? There is no replacement that's coming up enough. So it just proves to you that something is going on, and that the details is not in the pudding. So it's in the gutter. All right, it's in the gutter. So that's the situation you have to remember. And just one more precept to wrap this up. It's going to be from the book of Jeremiah. All right, Jeremiah chapter 50 and 43. It says, the king of Babylon had heard the report of them, and his hands waxed feeble. Anguish took hold of him, and pangs as of a woman in travail. Yeah, so it's just the chaos, man, that is going to bring a lot of pain to the eyes of these politicians, man, the king of Babylon. Yeah, so expect a lot of people to be screaming and yelling and protesting at these federal buildings, at the White House, at Congress, and all that stuff. Then you have the guy going around with his camera, you know, on Capitol Hill, asking those staffers, you know, or politicians, America first or Israel first. None of them could give an answer. America first or Israel first. They couldn't give an answer, you know, as to where their loyalty lies. So it shows you that America is on its way out. The decline, the compromise has sent Babylon down the drain, man. Babylon is going down the drain. Yeah, so I'm just typing this right here, slippery. I'm gonna put 3 P's in there. Yeah, man. So just add one more to that. All right, one more correction. Yep. Yeah, that's it right there. Yeah. So Psalm 73 and 18. Surely thou didst set them in slippery places. Thou castest thou casted them down into destruction. Yeah, so that's the destiny of America, man. Destruction. That's just the way it is. And you know, it's just the pain they have to absorb. Even when you read the next precept, so wherefore their way shall be unto them as slippery ways in the darkness. They shall be driven on, all right, on and fall therein. For I will bring evil upon them, even the year of their visitation, said the Lord. All right. So that's how it is, man. Just like people went down the drain for sinning against the Lord. So do these empires have to go down the drain too for coming against the laws, statutes, and commandments of Yahweh Hashem Shai. So it's a balance. The righteous had to bear their iniquity, and so does the wicked also. All right. So it's going to be beautiful, man. To see how the Lord is going to make Babylon fall apart, man. So yeah, this precept, man. Luke chapter 14. It's a very important precept to remember, man. Babylon doesn't want to pay the cost for victory. They don't want to pay the cost for victory. They don't. The scam. The scam is more important to them than victory. So that's how precious the e-files have become. So that's the point of this lesson. Avaratiza, you've been edified, and just keep an eye out, man. See how this budget is gonna go through, man. And then you see how the TSA workers that are still going without pay. Shalom.